All right, this will be the first of a four-part series on the product market, and I want to start with introducing just some basic concepts. First things first, I want to kind of discuss the case for the market in the first place. And so, when we think about markets, we think about the interaction of supply, which are producers and sellers, and demand, which are consumers buying things, and they interact in markets. And what we'll find as we go through this material is where these two curves intersect, we end up in a very magical place called equilibrium, where the market is stable at a market clearing price of a certain amount and a certain quantity being sold per unit of time. Um, but before we kind of get there, I want to make some basic assumptions and just provide some general content that the reason markets exist in the first place is because of this idea of mutually beneficial exchange. And what that means is simply that markets happen because each party is better off by making a transaction than not. And this concept of being better off is expressed economically through the concepts of consumer and producer surplus. Now, a key factor to keep in mind is someone will not pay a higher price for something than what they value it at. So, in other words, somebody is not going to pay $12 for a bottle of water that they only have a value of $4 for. That would violate an assumption of being a rational actor. And what's important to note here is that the value of a product can change based off of context. So you can say, for example, I would never pay $12 for a bottle of water. Well, what if you needed a bottle of water and you were walking through the desert parched? Then you might pay 12, you might pay 20, you might pay 20,000. And so it's very important to recognize that value is subjective and value can change depending on circumstances and context. Another reason why markets are a preferred mechanism for resource allocation is that they reveal preferences. And to me, this is a very important thing. Um, we know that there is a market for Pepsi Cola because consumers buy it. And when we say the market reveals preferences, we know how much people like it by how much they purchase. Um, and it reveals preferences in ways that polling and other markets, or other methods, I should say, are simply unable to do. Take, for example, if you asked people, do you like socially undesirable activity? Well, most people would say, no, I find that abhorrent. I would never engage in such activity. But yet, there's a large market for what are considered socially unacceptable behaviors. Okay? Now, for markets to really function effectively, you need to have property rights, um, freedom of action, and information to make well informed decisions. Now, let's dig a little more into the idea of consumer and producer surplus. Consumer surplus is simply the difference between what someone would be willing and able to pay for a product and what they did. Producer surplus is the difference between what the producer is willing and able to accept and what they received for a product. If you add the consumer surplus and the producer surplus together, you will get what we call total surplus. Now, let's take a very simple example here of a consumer for coffee. So, Asta 12 Trees, she values coffee at $5. The market price is $4. So she will buy a cup of coffee and she will have a consumer surplus of $1. She values it at 5. The price is 4. She comes out $1 ahead. Harry, he values it 8. So he has a stronger preference for coffee than Asta does. And so he's going to gain a $4 surplus. Dean only values it at 2. So he does not have a strong consumer preference for coffee. So he will not buy a cup. He's not going to pay $4 for something that he values at 2. Beth apparently is a coffee fiend and is willing to pay 10 when the price is 4, so she gets a surplus of 6. Pretty straightforward mathematics here, and of course Don would not buy coffee because the price is higher than the value. What accounts for differences in valuation? Well, preferences is the big thing. Some people have a stronger preference for buying coffee than others. Another factor that could come into play is disposable income. Some people may only have a $2 value because that's what they can afford at the time. But either way, that's how we calculate consumer surplus in the market. Producer surplus, kind of the same deal. Move the numbers around a bit. So let's say that the coffee shack, it would cost them $4 to make a cup of coffee. That's what they're willing to accept as a price. The market price is $2.50. They won't sell coffee. They can't sell a $4 cup of coffee in a $2.50 world. They would be losing surplus, so they won't do it. Same here. Speedway can. It only costs them $1 to make a cup. They can sell for $2.50. They're $1.50 ahead. So you can see how producer surplus works. Again, pretty straightforward math. What accounts for the differences? Well, a few things. It's their cost structure. I use Speedway gas station as an example. They buy their product in tremendous bulk because there are speedways throughout the Midwest. So they buy their coffee by the semi-load, whereas maybe one of these local coffee houses that I've envisioned here can only buy a couple of cases at a time. So they do not benefit from the cost savings that you get from large scale purchases. Let's take a very simple example here. Let's say that we've got Joe. He is willing to pay $200 for a desk, he's willing to pay $500 for a desk. Gary is selling a desk. He would accept $200 as his rock bottom price. They negotiate and they arrive at a selling price of $400. What's the surplus here? Well, the consumer surplus is $100. Why? Because Joe was willing to pay $5. He did pay $4, so he comes out $100 ahead. The producer surplus is $200. Willing to sell at $2, got $400 out of it, and then the total surplus would be $300. Those are the two added together. A final thing that makes the market a compelling reason to resource allocate is that the market price serves as a rationing agent. And what does that mean? Well, prices in a market are critically important because they send vital signals to economic actors. Okay? So, an increasing price encourages individuals to reduce consumption, and it also sends a signal for producers to make more of the product. Whereas a lowering of price sends a signal to producers to make less of the product and for consumers to purchase more because there's a glut in the market. Okay? Our next video, we will start digging deeper into supply and demand.